Okay, great. All right. So, my name is Jane Malenfant. My pronouns are they, she, and talking about co-design, co-production, and community research is one of my favorite things to do. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Education at Concordia University. And so a little bit about where I'm joining from today. I am actually calling from Tiohtià:ke, which is unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. In Kanien'kehá:ka, it's Tiohtià:ke. In Anishinaabemowin, it's Muniang, and French Canadians and English Canadian settlers call it Montreal. And so the star on this map is where I live and work today. I'm from Kapuskasing, Ontario, the little home at the top, which is about a 13-hour drive directly north of here. And that is Treaty 9 territory. It's the ancestral territory of the Cree, and especially the Moose Cree. I'm a settler with French, Cree, and Scottish ancestry. And so the lands that I work on and have lived on throughout my life and really have shaped my experiences and how I come into my research. As I mentioned, I'm in the Faculty of Education. I primarily study sociology of education, but also looking at kind of sociological inquiries of homelessness, education, and activism, both in Tiohtià:ke and in Canada broadly. And I really focus on the co-production of research with youth with lived experience of homelessness. I'm someone with lived experience of homelessness myself. So I come into it as someone with lived experience who's been engaged as kind of a peer researcher on participatory projects and asked to consult on co-designing different models in nonprofits, but also in research. So working across those different contexts and developing peer learning and peer support for people who do these kinds of roles on research projects. So creating networks of peer support for researchers with lived experience. And my work is broadly influenced by youth participatory action research, institutional ethnography, and anarchist and activist methodologies. So smushing all of those together is how I kind of approach my work on co-production. And so I wanted to begin with kind of my perspective, and I'm hoping we can share how folks have been coming into this, of why we would do co-design and why we would do participatory research and what that work aims to address. And so, Sophie, you mentioned that funders there are kind of pushing for this kind of work. I think it's a little bit more complex here and probably is there where funders don't quite know what they're asking for or why they're asking for it. But the reason why I aim to do this work is because research has served and continues to serve to devalue, objectify, and commodify lived knowledges of communities facing oppression. So I would imagine within an Australian context, as in a Canadian settler colonial context, we can see the ways that research has upheld really unjust power dynamics and the invisibility, commodification of communities through kind of objective framing of research. People with lived experience of social issues to be studied are often deemed unable to know their own realities. So within my work, that's people who've experienced homelessness and queer and trans communities. We can look at how this impacts Indigenous communities and communities of color, disabled communities. And so I also think we can speak about people with lived experience within this, but also people who are practitioners. So people who do frontline work are often also lumped into this. People who are too close to issues to really be able to see them in an objective way. We can also see obfuscation and abstraction of people's experiences and kind of turning people's lives into data. So this is part of why I do this work, because I've been to conferences where I've seen experiences I've had and the experiences of my loved ones turned into these statistics that are completely detracted from what our day-to-day realities are on the ground. And particularly the ways that expertise within research can be positioned as apolitical and objective. So any kind of attempt to bring lived experience or community into research can be seen as politicizing research or, taking on standpoints or perspectives that are maybe not as objective or not as clear. And so I would say all of these things are reasons why this work is proposed and this work is carried out. But I think there's also this second aspect that is related to those of addressing historical and ongoing exclusion in spaces of power and knowledge. So for me, who works with a lot of young people who have experienced homelessness, getting kicked out of school or pushed out of high school is really common. It happened to me. And so the idea that you would even graduate high school, be able to enter post-secondary spaces is very rare. And so what we see happen is that people are not even getting to the table of kind of research and academia because there's so many barriers to entering that space. And so the people who aren't at the table, this kind of research would try to address that in different ways. And so I wanted to also remind us of the ways that this work is grounded in radical movements and activist movements. And this is also something that influences my work. And so we can think of the phrase "nothing about us without us," which I use a lot, which is used primarily or originally within disability activism, but is taken up by a lot of communities that see their issues being spoken on without them being present. And so we can look at the radical roots of co-design. We can see this grounded in movements from critical disability activists, feminists, Black and Indigenous resistance, and LGBTQ2SIA movements. And I want to bring attention to this in particular because this work is already often being done in communities, and often being done in communities against system and structures of oppression. And so Vicki Reynolds, who's a scholar from Vancouver here in Canada, talks about the fact that communities are often already doing research. It's just not recognized within universities. So we're doing research to figure out what's going on. We're trying to understand how, laws and policies organize our lives. And we're trying to do research to keep people in our communities alive. And so this is something that I see working in research that works on issues of poverty and homelessness, that this work is also very urgent. So people who are already organizing to know what is happening are doing so because it's very urgent. These issues are really impacting people's lives, and sometimes it's a matter of life and death. And so this is happening within, Sophie, as you mentioned, this kind of increasing institutional awareness around the need to include people with lived knowledges and experiences. And so this is happening in my field of trying to incorporate people with lived and living experiences of homelessness. And broadly, I think probably in many of our institutions with, say, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. So these, we can look at Sarah Ahmed's work, we can look at Melinda Smith's work. The way that these policies and attempts to include different communities and different knowledges and voices are done within institutions are often tokenistic. They're often kind of limited in how they imagine inclusion. They're often commodifying people's experiences. And often what Marie Batiste, a Mi'kmaq scholar, calls kind of add and stir inclusion of people with lived experience. And Batiste talks about this in the context of including Indigenous knowledges within the Canadian settler colonial school system, as kind of taking a system that has historically done a lot of harm to a community, has continue to exclude that community and kind of plopping knowledges on top of a structure without changing the structure itself. And so when we're thinking of creating space for communities to engage in research or participate in research without changing the underlying structure, that inclusion doesn't happen. And so the lessons that I want to share today come from my work, particularly in Tiohtià:ke, with a group of young people called the Youth Action Research Revolution. And actually, if folks had heard Naomi Nichols talk about this last year, we co-led the same project. So there's a lot of stuff I might be talking about that Naomi talked about from a different perspective. And so our group is 6 researchers. 5 of us have lived experience of homelessness. So it's myself, Cheyenne, Maxime, Laurence, and Naomi. And we also have different experiences of navigating social systems. And so we spoke with dozens and dozens of young people in the city to figure out how they had been experiencing schools, child welfare systems, criminal justice systems. And what we really wanted to do at the heart of it was design it with people with lived experience, for people with lived experience, to have impacts on that community. And we continue to do that work as well. And so I wanted to outline a few different kind of challenges that I've found, both working on this project as someone who is a researcher who aims to do participatory work and co-design and collaborate and co-produce knowledge, but also as someone who is sometimes on the other side of that, and being kind of asked to do advisory work for projects where people don't have lived experience of the issue they're studying. And so the first one is labor. And this comes up again and again and again, because I think the way that labor is organized in academia is very problematic anyway. But the one thing when asking people in communities to enter spaces where they aren't welcome and aren't made for them is that there's significant labor just to walk through the door. And so I think for myself, for young people I've worked with, even just inviting them to a university space can be a lot, and it can be emotional labor, and it can be physical and psychological labor just to deal with that. Also, when people are invited in to share lived experience, it's often in the form of kind of doing educating work for other people who don't have those experiences. And so the difference between perhaps sharing statistics about a social issue and sharing a story that is part of your past and might be traumatic, is that there's a lot more labor that goes into recovering and preparing to talk about your lived experiences. And so when I do this kind of work, I always advocate for, if funding structures want to support this work, they need to be able to give resources to support people to do it in a safe way. This labor is also often hidden. It's invisibilized in how we write grant proposals and project proposals and how we write articles even. It's also emotional, it's gendered, and it's racialized, and it's often undervalued, unpaid, and invisible. And so this goes for academia broadly, but I think particularly when we're inviting people in communities who are not academics necessarily or are designing programs, ensuring that we understand how much labor is going in is really important. And I think within this, I can also see the invisibility of the academic gains, which are built on communities' backs. So a lot of times we can kind of look at different dollars and funding to say, okay, well, we'll make sure we pay this young person this much money to do this. They'll come to a guest lecture. We'll pay them a couple $100. That's great. But really, many academics who study these issues build their careers off of learning from young people or people who are engaged in community in different ways. And so that is often invisibilized when we're thinking of the benefits to different communities. And kind of related to that, performativity. So what happens when we write a grant and say we're going to do this thing, but we don't know how to do it, or there's no accountability necessarily for how we might go about doing it and ensuring we're doing it well. So this, again, I can see from both perspectives. I can see that I have to perform that I'm doing particular kinds of research for funding bodies or for the university, but I can also see how, as someone with lived experience, I am supposed to perform the right kind of lived experience. The stories that I tell about my past are supposed to be stories that lead into a particular narrative, and those narratives are often ones that are centered on kind of an upward trajectory or redeemability. And so the idea being, the stereotype that, well, if people want to be homeless, they're lazy, or it's their own fault. And so I often see when stories are asked for, they're supposed to be the right kind of stories. And if you tell the wrong kind of stories, that's not really what people want when they're engaging people in community. Experiences also then often become kind of commodified or objectified in ways to support what research is already finding. And so I think that the ways that research is still kind of perpetuated as the upper echelon of hierarchies of knowledge, we can say that we're disrupting that, but it takes a lot of work to actually disrupt it. And I think thinking also of performing the right kind of lived experience or the right kind of entering into research spaces is that you aren't too political, you aren't too damaged, that you're not coming in, being unprofessional in spaces or crying or breaking down or showing up high. All of these things that many young people I work with do regularly because they're still navigating homelessness. You're also not supposed to bring in knowledge that isn't lived expertise. So I think we can also see, you're not supposed to be citing theory because you come in this role, and this role is as a community researcher or someone with lived experience who's consulting. And so how do we perform these things both as researchers and people coming into research projects? I also see there's a huge amount of murkiness and ambiguity, and I think this really stems from this being fairly new. And it also stems from people really meaning well. And so what happens a lot in these kinds of projects is that people will enter, engage with people in community, and then say, you can do whatever you want because you're the person who has lived experience. I don't want to tell you what to do because that would reinforce these kind of historical power dynamics. But what happens is that we are working within systems that do have parameters, do have limitations, do have objectives, do have kind of ethics parameters that may or may not fall in line with ethics of participants or peer researchers. And so not having that clear can often lead to people with lived experience coming in and, you know, imagining what a project could be ideally, and then being told, oh no, we can't do that. And I think part of that is a lack of transparency around decision making. So there isn't necessarily responsibility for who is making those decisions. I've been on many research teams, I've done it myself, where I say, oh, well, the funding won't allow us to do that. Or, oh, this organization, we can't actually do this. Or the university doesn't really allow for that, or that's not really how it's done. And so if we don't explain those parameters and the kind of context within which we do this work, that's also still maintaining power and knowledge in the hands of researchers in the university spaces. And so I think this also leads to kind of a ceiling of inclusion. So people can be included up to a certain point, and often that stays within the realm of kind of advising or consulting in these one-off kind of instances, rather than really building relationships and building decisions together and understanding how this system works, how academic structures and research structures work. And that's really important, I think, to include and illuminate and really make transparent those processes. I also think that resources and valuation of this kind of work need to really move forward and pick up steam. I know within our context, research funding, as well as nonprofit funding, is not really set up for the scale of really meaningful participatory research or co-production of research. And so there might be an emphasis that organizations, government funding, and universities are more drawn to this kind of research, but I don't see them acknowledging the amount of resources that it takes to do this in a good way and do it in a meaningful way. And part of that is building relationships and building them meaningfully. So I've been consulted to see if people could do similar projects to what we were doing. And I've said, if you can only go spend time with people who are peer researchers once a month, that's going to be really tricky, because I was spending time with them almost every day during my doctorate. We're still working together. And so building those relationships where they can build trust with researchers takes a lot of time, because researchers have historically not been great to marginalized communities. So coming in, you have to show up and you have to actually do the work. And it is helpful if you also come from that community. And I would say also limited funding or resources mean that people with lived experience work in isolation. So there might be one person on an advisory or one person on a decision-making board. And that means that person doesn't have any peers to say, is this okay? Is this funky? I don't feel safe right now. And so it leads really to the maintenance of the same kind of power structures. And so one way, I can go on and on about the limitations, I think, but one way that we've been talking about it as a team, and from both an institutional ethnographic standpoint, but also from a broader kind of Marxist feminist standpoint, is thinking of this as standpoint. And so we can see that standpoint arises from conscious resistance struggle against the prevailing and hegemonic forms of oppressive consciousness. And so part of what standpoint has offered our team, and in the different ways that we've engaged with it, is seeing our kind of perspective, or the way that we enter into knowing social organization, as based in resistance, but also as based in knowledge. And so I think one thing that happens a lot when we include people who have not been at the table historically is that we see it as a kind of equity seeking thing, or we see it as inclusion. But in reality, what it means is that we know more. We know more about the social issues that we're trying to study. And so we actually have a clear picture of what's going on. And there's so many stories I have of working with peers who are also working at different kind of within organizations, within research projects, where we can see academics who don't have lived experience talking about the realities of these issues, or the realities of homelessness. And we know that they're not getting it, that they're missing pieces, but they're presenting it as fact because they've studied these people. And so I think standpoint has allowed us to understand different ways that we can see the overarching kind of social organization of the things that people in our team are facing, but also broader, communities of young people who are experiencing precarity and homelessness. Sorry, I'm chatting real fast because I want to get into a discussion. And so one way that I've also been framing this in thinking of how we can do this work in a good way is moving from inclusion and the idea of including people within a structure that already exists to building out research for solidarity. And I think that it's really important to understand that within a solidarity framework, this means that we're all building towards changing things towards justice. And that we all have a stake in this, and that it's not really just, oh, we're going to let people come in now because it's the right thing to do, but that really building solidarity will benefit all of us. And so solidarity, and this is an approach that we use with our team, allows for multi-directional learning for mutual benefit. And so this means that, for example, Naomi, who was the one person on the team who didn't have lived experience of homelessness, had lived experience of navigating a lot of bureaucratic structures and institutions and universities. And so she could bring knowledge to our team about that, and we could bring knowledge about other things that she had never experienced. And so we were all learning from each other. We did work with legal students, and they brought in knowledge we didn't know about the legal system, and we brought in knowledge about how that legal system is experienced every day by young people. And so through building solidarity, we could see that our goals are the same and we're coming from different perspectives, but we're doing it to advance kind of justice and equity for all. And I think that solidarity also allows us to shift how we think about this towards building structures from charity to equity. And I would say there is, maybe not particularly within research, but we can see this within nonprofit organizations, this kind of approach where charity is the model, and we can see that shifting, and we can understand how we're not just helping poor people out, for example, but we're actually recognizing that communities should not experience homelessness and people shouldn't be experiencing homelessness at all. So what are the structures that are leading to that, and how can we change them? And solidarity also sees us as all responsible to address systems that harm any of us. And so in this way, we can see intersecting forms of oppression as interconnected, not just if we experience them, but also how our experiences within systems are related to other people's experiences. And so within that, even those of us who have privilege to enter spaces like universities, for example, have a responsibility to ensure that research doesn't only serve us and doesn't only serve to perpetuate these kinds of hierarchies of knowledge. And again, recognizes the work already being done to resist and survive systems of oppression and harness those learnings. That not only can we recognize that communities are already doing work to survive and are learning and are doing their own research, but we can learn from how those are already organized in order to make research spaces more just. And so thinking of our project, and I have lots of things that I think could work, and I love to imagine how this work could look like in the future, but so far, the things that have worked in my experience, the first of which is really taking engagement and co-creation seriously. So that means prioritizing time, resources, and recognizing the emotional toll that doing this work will take. And I think, I'm sure for anyone who does work around social issues, it's difficult work. It's work that can seem overwhelming, whether you're doing frontline, whether you're doing research. And so really making space for that being prioritized is important, and recognizing that sometimes other things are going to take a back seat, and maybe that's writing articles. Maybe that's not something that's a priority in these projects, and really pushing back against that being prioritized. Also building lived experience throughout projects and into governance and decision making, so that communities or partners or advisories or committees or peer researchers are not just brought in for consultation at different points or to do knowledge mobilization, but rather are included throughout. And I think the model that we had, where I was kind of sitting in an in-between place and could speak to both academia and communities who were experiencing homelessness, was a great model, because I was learning as I went on both sides, and could bring my knowledge in different ways. Being humble and actively rejecting hierarchies of expertise, because I think this is the system. We're going to always make mistakes. And so we made so many mistakes in our project, but they weren't life or death mistakes. They were, research mistakes. And so when we're part of a community, our team has lost so many loved ones over the past few years, especially during COVID with the opioid pandemic. Messing up research things doesn't seem that important when you're actually, dealing with life and death. And so I've tried to explain this, it's hard to go into a space and be humble and not necessarily go in as an expert when you have expertise in different things. But I think creating spaces for feedback where you can say, did this work? Did this not work? What are we going to do next time? Has been so beneficial, because they're difficult spaces where sometimes it's really hard, but then you move on and you learn how to do them better moving forward. And then again, advocating for the resources and funding that are needed to conduct research that matters to communities, because it sounds that there might be some shifts there as well, but I still think we're a long way from actually, wanting research that is going to really benefit communities and not necessarily benefit academia. So I'm someone who thinks all research should be for social change, because research is situated within structures that need to be part of changing how social organizations happen. They must happen in collaboration with those most impacted. I think this is important for so many reasons that they've laid out, and should actually be led by communities. How can we make structures of research that are led by communities and supported by researchers and institutions? Building new structures where we're all supported to shape research and knowledge, so we don't have to be thinking of inclusion, but really shifting those structures so we don't have to include people in an existing kind of shell of what we've done before. And then create spaces for community at all stages of the project, even before funding is reached, proposal phase, ethics phase, that this is happening throughout, and in meaningful ways. And then really thinking of compensation and valuing lived experience in really tangible and meaningful ways. And so these seem kind of simple and also really difficult to imagine. But I think that these are kind of guideposts for how I've been navigating research whenever possible. And so I can send these slides around. This is also my email. I love talking about all of this stuff, and I would love to continue talking about it with all of you